The morning coffee in the Denver Veterans Affairs Medical Center went cold as everyone watched Maya Rodriguez hit the floor, her patient files scattering like autumn leaves across the polished linoleum. Director James Mitchell stood over her. With the satisfaction of a man who'd just proven his point, his expensive leather shoes deliberately planted on her medical reports. What nobody knew was that the quiet woman picking up those papers had single-handedly carried 15 dying soldiers through enemy fire to safety, and the revelation of that truth would destroy Mitchell's career in the most spectacular way possible. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The Denver VA Medical Center's main corridor buzzed with its usual Monday morning chaos, wheelchairs rolling past reception, families clutching visitor badges, the steady hum of an institution dedicated to caring for America's veterans. Maya Rodriguez moved through this familiar landscape like a ghost, her small frame barely registering among the crowd of medical staff, administrators, and patients. At 5'3" and barely 120 pounds, she looked more like someone who needed protecting than someone capable of extraordinary heroism. Maya had worked at the center for 8 months now, transferred from a smaller facility in Colorado Springs, under circumstances that remained frustratingly vague in her personnel file. She kept to herself, took the shifts nobody else wanted, and performed her duties as a medical technician with quiet competence that somehow went unnoticed by those who mattered most. Her supervisor's reports were filled with damning phrases. Lacks assertiveness, too soft-spoken for leadership roles, appears overwhelmed by challenging situations. What they didn't see were the small details that told a different story. The way her hands never shook during medical emergencies, no matter how chaotic the situation became. How she could assess a patient's condition with a single glance, often catching problems that experienced doctors missed. The unconscious way she scanned every room for exits and potential threats, a habit burned into her nervous system by experiences she never discussed. Director James Mitchell had made Maya his personal project from the moment she'd arrived. At 52, Mitchell was everything the modern VA administrator was supposed to be: polished, well-connected, media-savvy, and completely convinced of his own importance. His corner office was decorated with photographs of him shaking hands with congressmen and posing at ribbon-cutting ceremonies. What was notably absent from his wall of achievements was anything suggesting he'd ever worn a uniform or understood the weight of genuine sacrifice. Rodriguez. Mitchell's voice cut through the morning bustle like a blade, causing several people to turn and stare. Maya stopped walking, her shoulders tensing almost imperceptibly as she turned to face him. She held a stack of patient intake forms, her morning assignment that would take her to the medical wing where veterans received treatment for everything, from routine checkups to complex PTSD therapy. Mitchell approached with the deliberate swagger of someone who enjoyed having an audience. His expensive suit was perfectly tailored, his silver hair styled with precision, and his smile carried all the warmth of winter steel. Running late again, I see. Some of us have been here since 6 a.m., but I suppose that kind of dedication is beyond someone with your limitations. The corridor had gone quieter now, conversations trailing off as people sensed the familiar tension that accompanied one of Mitchell's public performances. Maya stood perfectly still, her dark eyes fixed on a point somewhere beyond Mitchell's left shoulder. She'd learned that direct eye contact only made these encounters worse. "I arrived at my scheduled time, sir," she said softly, her voice barely carrying beyond their immediate vicinity. The response only seemed to fuel Mitchell's satisfaction. "Scheduled time," he repeated, loud enough for everyone within 30 feet to hear clearly. "You know what we call people who did the bare minimum where I come from: dead weight." The irony of Mitchell criticizing anyone's military bearing, while having never served himself, was lost on no one except Mitchell himself. Dr. Amanda Foster, the chief of psychiatry, paused in her conversation with two other physicians to watch the scene unfold. She'd worked with Maya several times over the past few months and had been consistently impressed by the young woman's intuitive understanding of trauma patients. Veterans who refused to talk to other staff members opened up to Maya with remarkable frequency. There was something in her presence that conveyed understanding without judgment, experience without condescension. "I've been reviewing your performance reports," Mitchell continued, pulling out his phone as if consulting official documents, consistently rated as adequate by supervisors. No leadership initiative, no suggestions for improvement, no evidence of the kind of aggressive problem-solving we need in this facility. He looked around at his growing audience, ensuring maximum impact for his words. Maya's fingers found the small pendant hanging from a chain around her neck, hidden beneath her uniform shirt. It was her only unconscious tell, a gesture so subtle that only the most observant would notice. Her thumb traced over the surface 15 times in rapid succession before she caught herself and stopped. "Perhaps," Mitchell said, stepping closer, until he was invading her personal space, "you should consider whether you're really cut out for this kind of work. The VA isn't a place for people who can't handle pressure. Our veterans deserve better than someone who wilts under basic scrutiny." That was when Maya's files scattered across the floor. Later, witnesses would disagree about exactly how it happened. Some said Mitchell had simply gestured too aggressively and knocked them from her hands. Others insisted they saw him deliberately strike the stack of papers. What everyone agreed on was what happened next. Maya dropped to her knees without complaint and began collecting the scattered documents with methodical precision, while Mitchell planted his foot on several pages and made no move to help. "This is exactly what I'm talking about," Mitchell announced to his captive audience. "No fight, no backbone, just immediate surrender. This is what happens when we lower our standards and start hiring people based on sympathy rather than capability." Captain Lisa Park had been heading to her office in the administrative wing when the commotion caught her attention. As the facility's liaison with active-duty military units, she'd seen her share of leadership styles, and Mitchell's performance made her skin crawl. But it was Maya's response that truly caught her attention, not the submission, but something else entirely. Maya moved with efficiency that spoke of training, not defeat. Her eyes constantly scanned the crowd, cataloging faces, exits, and potential threats with the automatic awareness of someone whose survival had once depended on such vigilance. When a piece of paper slid under a nearby bench, Maya retrieved it with a fluid motion that suggested far more physical capability than her small frame implied. Most telling of all was her breathing. Park had done 3 combat deployments and recognized the controlled respirations of someone managing stress through techniques learned under fire. Maya wasn't cowering, she was enduring, with the kind of disciplined patience that came from experiences far more dangerous than workplace humiliation. "Get yourself together, Rodriguez," Mitchell said, his voice dripping with false concern. "We can't have our medical staff falling apart during routine interactions. What would happen if you faced a real emergency?" Maya finished collecting the last of her papers and stood, her posture straight despite the degradation she'd just endured. When she spoke, her voice carried a quiet certainty that made several people lean forward to hear. "I would handle it, sir, just like I always do." The simplicity of her response seemed to deflate some of Mitchell's theatrical energy. He'd expected tears, apologies, or at least some visible sign that his performance had achieved its intended effect. Instead, he found himself facing someone whose composure remained unshakable, whose dignity couldn't be stripped away by public humiliation. "We'll see about that," Mitchell said, but his voice had lost some of its earlier conviction. He turned and walked away, leaving Maya standing in the corridor, surrounded by curious stares and uncomfortable silence. "Doctor, Foster approached as the crowd began to disperse, her expression mixing professional concern with personal frustration. "Maya, are you all right?" Mitchell was completely out of line. "I'm fine, Dr. Foster. Thank you for asking." Maya's response was automatic, polite, and completely unconvincing. "You don't have to pretend with me," Foster said gently. "What he just did was harassment, plain and simple. You could file a complaint." Maya's thumb found her hidden pendant again, tracing its surface with that same unconscious pattern. "Director Mitchell is under a lot of pressure to improve efficiency ratings. I understand his concerns about my performance." Foster wanted to argue, to point out that Maya's patient interaction scores were among the highest in the facility, that her diagnostic instincts had prevented several medical emergencies, that veterans specifically requested to work with her. But something in Maya's expression suggested that pushing the issue would only make things worse. "If you ever need to talk," Foster said instead, "my door is always open." Maya nodded and walked away, leaving Foster with the uncomfortable feeling that she was watching someone carry a burden far heavier than workplace harassment. There was something in Maya's eyes that spoke of experiences beyond the scope of civilian understanding, a weight that transformed Mitchell's petty cruelty into something almost insignificant by comparison. As Maya disappeared around the corner toward the medical wing, neither Foster nor Park realized they'd just witnessed the opening act of a drama that would expose truths capable of destroying careers and revealing heroism so profound it would redefine everyone's understanding of strength, courage, and sacrifice. The pendant Maya wore contained a small piece of metal with the number 15 etched into its surface, a number that would soon transform from a private memorial into public revelation, turning a woman dismissed as too weak into recognition as one of the most decorated combat veterans of her generation. But for now, Maya Rodriguez remained just another employee trying to survive another day under James Mitchell's toxic leadership, carrying secrets that weighed far more than the scattered papers she'd gathered from the cold linoleum floor. Maya Rodriguez lived in apartment 15C at Mountain View Veterans Housing Complex, a modest two-bedroom unit overlooking the Rockies that she'd chosen not for the view, but for the number on the door. Her morning alarm sounded at exactly 5:15 a.m., though she was always awake 15 minutes before it rang, a habit burned into her circadian rhythm by years of hypervigilance that civilian life couldn't erase. The apartment told its story through careful absences rather than revealing presences. No mirrors faced the bed because some mornings brought flashbacks that made her own reflection feel like a stranger. A go-bag sat packed by the door, containing exactly 15 items: water, protein bars, medical supplies, cash, identification documents, and other essentials for rapid evacuation. The shower lasted exactly 15 minutes, never longer, and she touched the pendant 15 times while the water ran. Each touch a name whispered too quietly for even God to hear. Her breakfast routine never varied: black coffee, wheat toast with peanut butter, and exactly 15 minutes of meditation that looked like staring out the window but served as daily reconnaissance of her neighborhood. Maya counted things obsessively without realizing it: 15 steps from her parking spot to the building entrance, 15 seconds of eye contact maximum during conversations, $15 kept in her console for emergencies that might never come. At the V, a medical center, Maya moved through her duties like a shadow that occasionally cast light into dark places. Other staff members barely registered her presence during shift changes and department meetings. She was simply that quiet veteran who took the night shifts nobody else wanted, who handled the difficult patients others avoided, and who somehow managed to be exactly where she was needed when emergencies arose. But Sergeant Tom Chun, a former Marine who worked in the physical therapy department, had begun noticing patterns that didn't fit the profile of someone Mitchell dismissed as incompetent. During a recent incident involving a veteran having a panic attack in the waiting room, Maya had appeared seemingly from nowhere and diffused situation with techniques that spoke of advanced training and crisis intervention. She didn't just calm them down, Chun mentioned to his colleague during their lunch break. She positioned herself between him and the exit, kept her hands visible, used specific language patterns. That's not something you learn in basic medical training. What truly caught Chun's attention was Maya's unconscious situational awareness. She automatically noted exit routes in every room, positioned herself where she could observe both entrances and crowds, and demonstrated the kind of peripheral vision that kept people alive in hostile environments. Her medical knowledge bordered on supernatural, a photographic memory for procedures, an ability to diagnose conditions other technicians missed, and hands that remained steady regardless of external chaos. Dr. Foster had been conducting her own informal observation of Maya's patient interactions, and what she discovered challenged everything Mitchell had been saying about the young woman's capabilities. Veterans with severe PTSD who refused treatment from other staff members sought Maya out specifically. Men who hadn't spoken about their combat experiences in years opened up to her within minutes of conversation. "There's something in her presence," Foster confided to Captain Park during a chance encounter in the hospital parking garage. "These patients trust her immediately. They recognize something in her that we're not seeing." Park had been thinking along similar lines. Her administrative position gave her access to personnel files and deployment records, and Maya's documentation contained suspicious gaps and inconsistencies. Large portions of her service record were redacted or missing entirely, replaced with vague references to classified operations and administrative reassignment for operational security. "I've been in the military for 15 years, Park told Foster. "I've never seen a file with this many blanks unless someone did something extraordinary or catastrophic. Either way, Mitchell doesn't have the full picture." Maya's medical skills manifested most clearly during emergencies, when her training overrode her deliberate invisibility. 3 weeks earlier, when veteran Jerry Patterson suffered a heart attack in the waiting room, Maya had performed CPR with textbook precision while simultaneously directing other staff members in supporting roles. Her commands were crisp, confident, and delivered with the natural authority of someone accustomed to life or death decision-making. "Start in 4, get me oxygen. Someone call the code team," she'd ordered, her voice cutting through the chaos with calm certainty. For those crucial minutes before the medical team arrived, Maya had transformed from meek technician into battlefield medic, her hands moving with practiced efficiency that spoke of experience far beyond her official job description. When the crisis ended and Patterson was stable, Maya had immediately retreated back into her quiet shell, deflecting praise and insisting she'd simply followed standard protocols. But several staff members noticed how she'd touched her pendant exactly 15 times while washing the blood from her hands, her lips moving silently in what looked like prayer or recitation. The pendant itself had become an object of curiosity among observant colleagues. Maya wore it constantly, hidden beneath her uniform shirt, but occasionally it caught the light during patient interactions. Those who glimpsed it reported seeing numbers etched into its surface, though no one had gotten close enough to read them clearly. Her apartment building's maintenance supervisor, Bill Martinez, had his own theories about the quiet tenant in 15C. Maya had specifically requested the unit number, offering to pay extra if necessary, and she maintained the space with military precision that went far beyond normal cleanliness. More intriguingly, she'd installed additional security measures, motion sensors, reinforced door locks, and blackout curtains that suggested someone with serious concerns about operational security. "She pays her rent 15 minutes early every month," Martinez mentioned to his wife. "Always in cash, always the exact amount. And she knows things about security systems that most people don't learn in civilian jobs." Maya's interactions with other veterans at the facility revealed additional layers of complexity that Mitchell's harassment couldn't touch. During group therapy sessions that she technically wasn't qualified to attend, veterans would seek her out for quiet conversations that seemed to provide more healing than formal treatment. She had an intuitive understanding of combat trauma that transcended textbook knowledge, responding to triggers and symptoms with the insight of someone who'd traveled the same dark roads. "She gets it," said Marine veteran Carlos Rodriguez. No relation after a particularly difficult session. "Whatever happened to her over there, she understands what we're carrying. She doesn't try to fix us or analyze us, she just gets it." But Maya's most telling behavior occurred during the facility's monthly emergency preparedness drills. While other staff members followed standard evacuation procedures, Maya automatically assumed tactical positions that maximized visibility and minimized exposure. She counted exit routes, identified potential choke points, and positioned herself where she could assist others while maintaining strategic advantage. "She moves like infantry," Chun observed during one such drill. "Not medical support, not administrative staff. Like someone who's been shot at and learned how to stay alive." The accumulated observations painted a picture that contradicted everything Mitchell believed about Maya's capabilities and background. Here was someone whose reflexes had been honed by experiences far more dangerous than bureaucratic harassment, whose medical knowledge suggested field training under conditions that most civilians couldn't imagine, and whose quiet competence masked a depth of experience that official records seemed determined to hide. What none of them realized was that Maya Rodriguez wasn't just a veteran struggling with workplace harassment. She was a living legend whose heroism had been deliberately buried in classified files and administrative anonymity. The number 15 that she touched obsessively wasn't just a personal ritual. It was a memorial to the most extraordinary rescue operation in modern military history, carried out by a soldier who'd been written off as too small, too weak, and too female to serve in combat roles. The truth about Maya Rodriguez was about to surface, and when it did, it would transform not just her standing at the VA Medical Center, but the very definition of what strength looked like in the face of impossible odds. Director Mitchell's campaign against Maya intensified with the methodical precision of someone who'd made destroying careers into an art form. The morning after the corridor humiliation, he called Maya into his office for what he termed a performance improvement discussion, though the meeting felt more like an interrogation designed to break her spirit entirely. Mitchell's corner office was a shrine to his own importance awards from healthcare management associations, photographs with politicians, and a wall of certificates that proclaimed his expertise in areas he'd never actually practiced. Conspicuously absent was any evidence that he'd ever worn a uniform or understood the weight of genuine service to others. "Sit," Mitchell commanded without looking up from his computer screen, letting Maya stand in uncomfortable silence for several minutes while he typed with theatrical importance. When he finally acknowledged her presence, his expression carried the satisfaction of a predator who'd cornered wounded prey. "Your performance metrics are concerning," he began, though Maya knew her patient satisfaction scores were consistently among the highest in the facility. Response time to supervisor requests, initiative in problem solving, willingness to take on additional responsibilities, all below acceptable standards. Maya sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap, her dark eyes focused on a point just over Mitchell's left shoulder. The only sign of her internal tension was the almost imperceptible way her thumb traced over her pendant through the fabric of her uniform shirt, counting silently in patterns of 15. "I'm reassigning you to janitorial support," Mitchell announced, savoring each word like expensive wine. "Effective immediately. Perhaps cleaning bathrooms will teach you about attention to detail and the importance of following orders without question." The reassignment was both cruel and strategic. Maya's medical expertise would be wasted on menial labor, while patients who'd come to rely on her steady presence would be forced to work with less competent staff. Mitchell understood that destroying someone like Maya required more than just humiliation. It required the complete separation from purpose that gave her work meaning. Additionally, Mitchell continued, you'll be working the midnight shift. Security duties, emptying trash, basic maintenance. I want you to understand what happens to employees who can't meet professional standards. Maya nodded once, her voice steady when she finally spoke. When do I start? Mitchell had expected tears, arguments, or at least some visible sign that his psychological warfare was achieving its intended effect. Instead, he found himself facing someone whose composure remained unshakable, whose dignity couldn't be stripped away by bureaucratic humiliation. Tonight, and Rodriguez? Mitchell leaned forward with predatory intensity. This is your last chance. One more performance issue, one complaint about your attitude, and you'll be looking for work elsewhere. The VA has no place for people who can't handle real responsibility. What Mitchell didn't realize was that his punishment had actually freed Maya to do what she did best. Night shifts at the VA meant working alongside security guards who were often veterans themselves, patients who couldn't sleep due to PTSD nightmares, and emergency situations that occurred when most of the regular medical staff had gone home. Within her first week of janitorial duty, Maya had prevented 2 medical emergencies, talked a suicidal veteran down from the roof, and somehow managed to keep the entire facility running smoother than it had in months. Her official duties might have been emptying trash cans and mopping floors, but her actual impact extended far beyond anything Mitchell could have imagined. Sergeant Chun had begun tracking Maya's movements during these night shifts, partly out of professional curiosity and partly because her behavior continued to challenge everything he thought he understood about her background. She moved through the darkened corridors with the confident navigation of someone accustomed to operating in hostile territory, her awareness extending far beyond normal civilian vigilance. She knows things, Chun confided to Dr. Foster during a chance encounter in the hospital cafeteria. Last night, she diagnosed a pulmonary embolism in a patient that 3 doctors had missed, while she was supposedly cleaning windows. That's not luck or intuition, that's advanced medical training. Dr. Foster had been conducting her own investigation into Maya's treatment, and what she'd discovered made her blood boil with righteous anger. Mitchell had been systematically sabotaging Maya's work assignments, ensuring she received the most demeaning tasks while simultaneously criticizing her for not showing more initiative. He's creating a hostile work environment, Foster explained to Captain Park during an impromptu meeting in the parking garage. But Maya won't file complaints, won't fight back, won't even acknowledge that what's happening to her is wrong. Park had been digging deeper into Maya's personnel files, using her security clearance to access records that revealed increasingly suspicious patterns. Large portions of Maya's service history remained classified at levels that suggested involvement in operations far more significant than routine medical support. I've been making inquiries through military channels, Park told Foster. Unofficial conversations with people who might have served with her. The responses I'm getting are ... interesting. The responses were more than interesting, they were revelatory. Park had contacted her former commanding officer, Colonel Sarah Williams, who'd served multiple combat deployments in Afghanistan. Williams's reaction to Maya's name had been immediate and intense. Maya Rodriguez? Are you sure that's who you're asking about? Williams's voice had carried a mixture of surprise and something approaching awe. If it's the same Maya Rodriguez I'm thinking of, you need to understand that woman is a genuine hero. What's she doing at a VA medical center? When Park explained the situation, Williams's tone had shifted to barely controlled fury. Someone is trying to bury her record, and they're doing a damn good job of it. Maya Rodriguez should be teaching at the War College, not cleaning bathrooms for some bureaucrat who's never heard a shot fired in anger. Meanwhile, Maya continued her quiet endurance of Mitchell's escalating harassment. He'd begun making surprise, inspections of her work, finding fault with tasks she'd completed to perfection, publicly criticizing her performance in front of other staff members, and spreading rumors about her emotional stability and fitness for duty. I'm beginning to question whether Rodriguez has the mental resilience for this work environment, Mitchell mentioned to several department heads during a weekly staff meeting. Veterans with unresolved combat issues can become liabilities rather than assets. We need to consider whether her continued employment poses risks to patient safety. The irony was staggering. Mitchell questioning the mental stability of someone whose psychological fortitude had been tested under conditions he couldn't begin to imagine. But his campaign was having unintended consequences. The more he attacked Maya, the more other staff members began paying attention to her actual capabilities. When veteran James Morrison suffered a severe panic attack during a routine appointment, Maya had appeared seemingly from nowhere and diffused the situation with techniques that spoke of advanced training in crisis intervention. Her voice had remained calm and steady, her positioning strategic, her commands clear and authoritative. She handled that better than our trained psychiatric staff, one nurse observed. Where did a medical technician learn those kinds of de-escalation techniques? Mitchell's response to Maya's obvious competence was to intensify his attacks. He began timing her breaks, criticizing her interaction with patients, and suggesting that her quiet demeanor indicated antisocial tendencies that made her unsuitable for healthcare work. Perhaps Rodriguez would be better suited for work that doesn't involve human interaction, he suggested during another public humiliation disguised as professional feedback. Some people simply aren't cut out for the demands of caring for others. The suggestion that Maya lacked compassion was so fundamentally wrong that several staff members began questioning Mitchell's judgment. Here was someone who worked exclusively with combat veterans, who understood their trauma with an intuition that transcended formal training, and who somehow managed to provide more effective support than counselors with advanced degrees. But Maya's most telling response to Mitchell's harassment came during a facility-wide emergency drill. When the simulation called for mass casualty triage, Maya had instinctively assumed command of the medical response, her voice cutting through chaos with natural authority that made everyone stop and listen. Critical patients to Trauma Bay 1, walking wounded to the East Corridor, psychological casualties need quiet spaces away from the noise. She directed, her hands moving with practiced efficiency while her eyes tracked multiple situations. Simultaneously, for those crucial minutes, Maya Rodriguez had transformed from meek janitor into battlefield commander, demonstrating leadership capabilities that made Mitchell's management style look petty and ineffective by comparison. When the drill ended, she'd immediately retreated back into her quiet shell, but the impression of competence and authority lingered. That wasn't a medical technician giving orders, Chun observed to Foster afterward. That was someone who's commanded medical operations under actual combat conditions. Mitchell noticed the drill performance too, and it terrified him. Here was evidence that everything he'd been saying about Maya's incompetence was not just wrong, but spectacularly, embarrassingly wrong. His solution was to double down on his harassment, hoping to drive her away before anyone realized the magnitude of his mistake. What he didn't know was that Captain Park had escalated her investigation to higher authorities, that Dr. Foster was documenting every instance of his abusive behavior, and that Maya's true service record was about to be revealed in ways that would end his career and transform her from victim into the hero she'd always been. The breaking point came when Captain Lisa Park received a phone call that changed everything. She was reviewing Maya's personnel file for the dozenth time when her secure line rang, displaying a number she recognized from her days at the Pentagon. Colonel Sarah Williams's voice carried the weight of someone who'd spent too many years watching good soldiers get buried by bureaucratic incompetence. "Captain Park, you've been asking questions about Maya Rodriguez," Williams said without preamble. "I need to know exactly what's happening to her and I need to know now. Park had expected resistance or deflection when she'd reached out through military channels. Instead, she'd triggered an immediate response from someone clearly invested in Maya's welfare. "Colonel, she's being systematically harassed by her supervisor. He's assigned her to janitorial duties, publicly humiliating her and questioning her mental fitness for duty." The silence that followed stretched long enough to make Park wonder if the connection had been lost. When Williams finally spoke, her voice carried barely controlled fury. "Maya Rodriguez is the most decorated combat medic of her generation. She single-handedly saved 15 lives during Operation Mountain Shield while under direct enemy fire. The fact that she's cleaning bathrooms instead of training the next generation of combat medics is a disgrace to everything this military claims to stand for." Park felt her world shift as the pieces began falling into place. "Colonel, her service record shows mostly administrative assignments. There's no mention of combat operations or decorations. That's because her record was classified to protect operational security and the lives of people who are still serving in sensitive positions. Maya Rodriguez didn't just save 15 soldiers, she carried them, one by one, through a kilometer of hostile territory while enemy forces closed in on all sides." Williams's voice took on the tone of someone recounting a legend. 72 hours behind enemy lines, her entire unit pinned down by coordinated assault. 15 wounded men who couldn't move on their own, and Maya Rodriguez weighing maybe 115 pounds soaking wet. Everyone said it was impossible. The math didn't work. The logistics were insane. Park was taking notes as fast as she could write. What happened? Maya happened. She rigged improvised stretchers, established a casualty collection point, and began moving wounded soldiers to a defensible position near an extraction zone. One at a time over 8 hours, while taking sporadic fire and coordinating air support through a radio that was more static than signal. The story Williams told defied belief. Maya had used her small size as an advantage, moving through terrain that would have been impassable for larger soldiers. She'd performed field surgery with minimal supplies, managed pain medication for multiple patients, and somehow maintained tactical awareness throughout an operation that should have been suicide. By the time extraction arrived, she'd moved all 15 wounded to safety and established a perimeter defense that held until reinforcements could reach them. The enemy had every advantage: numbers, positioning, local knowledge, heavy weapons. Maya had training, determination, and a refusal to let good soldiers die on her watch. Park was writing frantically, trying to capture details that sounded like fiction, but carried the weight of documented fact. "Colonel, why was this classified? This sounds like Medal of Honor territory. It should have been." Maya was recommended for the highest decorations, but the operation involved assets and techniques that couldn't be revealed without compromising ongoing missions. So her heroism got buried in classification stamps and administrative reassignments. Williams's voice softened slightly. Maya never complained, never demanded recognition or fair treatment. She just asked to continue serving, to keep helping soldiers who needed medical care. And instead of honoring that request, the system failed her so completely that she's now being harassed by some bureaucrat who's never heard a shot fired in anger. Meanwhile, Sergeant Tan Chun had been conducting his own investigation from a different angle. His connections in the veteran community had access to informal networks that sometimes knew more than official records. What he'd learned during late night conversations in VFW halls and American Legion posts painted a picture that aligned perfectly with Williams's account. "She's a ghost story among medics," explained Master Sergeant Rita Johnson, a retired combat medic Chen had served with during his second deployment. "Everyone's heard variations of the Mountain Shield rescue, but nobody could confirm who actually pulled it off. 15 lives saved by someone who shouldn't have been physically capable of the mission. Chun was beginning to understand why Maya's behavior had seemed so familiar yet impossible to categorize. The way she moves, the way she assesses situations, that's not standard medical training. No, it's not. That's someone who's been in situations where making the wrong decision gets people killed. Maya Rodriguez learned her trade in places where textbook medicine wasn't enough to keep soldiers breathing. Dr. Foster had been approaching the mystery from a clinical perspective, documenting Maya's interactions with PTSD patients and her uncanny ability to provide therapeutic support that exceeded formal training. What she'd discovered challenged her understanding of trauma recovery and peer counseling. These veterans trust her immediately, Foster explained to Park during one of their increasingly frequent conversations. Men who won't talk to trained therapists open up to Maya within minutes. It's not just empathy, it's recognition. They know she's been where they've been. Foster had begun recording Maya's patient interactions with permission, trying to understand the techniques she used to establish rapport and provide support. What she found was a combination of formal medical knowledge and intuitive understanding that suggested experience far beyond civilian healthcare. She uses specific language patterns that indicate training in combat stress control. She positions herself strategically during conversations, maintains visual contact with exits, and demonstrates awareness of potential triggers that most therapists wouldn't recognize. The three allies had begun meeting regularly, comparing notes and building a comprehensive picture of Maya's true capabilities and background. What emerged was a portrait of heroism that made Mitchell's harassment appear not just wrong, but criminally negligent. "We need to document everything," Park insisted during their latest meeting. Mitchell's behavior, Maya's actual performance, the discrepancies in her personnel file. When the truth comes out, we need evidence that shows how badly the system has failed her. Chun had been thinking along similar lines. Maya won't defend herself, won't file complaints, won't even acknowledge that she's being treated unfairly. So we need to be her advocates whether she wants them or not. Foster nodded. Agreement. I've been documenting every instance of Mitchell's harassment, every example of Maya's competence, every patient interaction that demonstrates her extraordinary capabilities. When the time comes, we'll have evidence that no one can dispute. What none of them realized was that their investigation had attracted attention from far higher levels than they'd imagined. Colonel Williams had not been idle since her conversation with Park. She'd made phone calls, pulled strings, and activated networks that reached into the highest levels of military and veteran affairs. Leadership. The wheels of justice turned slowly in bureaucratic systems, but they turned with crushing inevitability once set in motion. Mitchell's harassment campaign had made him enemies among people who valued competence over politics, and Maya's true service record was about to be revealed to people with the authority to act on that information. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The stage was being set for a confrontation that would expose Mitchell's incompetence, reveal Maya's heroism, and demonstrate that true strength couldn't be diminished by petty harassment from small-minded bureaucrats. The allies had gathered evidence, the investigation had reached critical mass, and Maya Rodriguez was about to receive the recognition she'd spent years avoiding but always deserved. The only question remaining was whether Mitchell would realize his mistake before it destroyed him completely, or whether his arrogance would blind him to the approaching reckoning that would transform a quiet janitor into recognition as one of the most extraordinary soldiers of her generation. The emergency began at 2:47 a.m. on a Tuesday night when Maya was finishing her janitorial rounds on the third-floor psychiatric ward. She'd been emptying trash cans and mopping corridors for 3 weeks now, her medical expertise relegated to menial labor while Mitchell continued his systematic campaign to drive her from the facility. But emergencies don't wait for convenient timing or proper job descriptions. The code blue alarm shattered the quiet night as veteran Michael Torres, A 24-year-old Marine with severe PTSD went into cardiac arrest in his room. The night shift was skeleton crew, 2 nurses, 1 resident physician who was covering his first week of overnight duty, and Maya Rodriguez, officially assigned to clean floors, but possessing more combat medical experience than the rest of the night staff combined. Dr. Kevin Walsh, the young resident, burst into Torres's room with panic written across his face. His hands shook as he attempted to establish an airway while the nurses struggled with floor placement and cardiac monitoring. Torres was dying, and everyone in the room knew that the window for successful resuscitation was measured in minutes. Maya heard the commotion from the hallway and moved toward the crisis without conscious decision. Her official duties might have been emptying wastebaskets, but her instincts had been honed by experiences where hesitation meant death. She paused at the doorway, watching Walsh fumble with equipment while precious seconds ticked away. "I can't get a pulse," Walsh said, his voice cracking with stress. "The airway's not clear, and I can't." "Step aside," Maya said quietly, her voice carrying absolute authority that made everyone in the room turn to look at her. Without waiting for permission, she moved to Torres's bedside, her hands taking control of the situation with practiced efficiency that spoke of training far beyond janitorial duties. Maya's transformation was instantaneous and complete. The quiet woman who'd been cleaning floors moments earlier became a combat medic operating under conditions that would have challenged seasoned emergency physicians. Her hands moved with supernatural precision, establishing an airway with techniques that Walsh had only read about in textbooks. "I need epinephrine, 1 milligram 4 push," she commanded, her voice steady and clear. "Get me a cardiac monitor with defibrillation capability, and someone start chest compressions at 120 per minute." Her orders carried the natural authority of someone who'd managed medical emergencies under enemy fire, where mistakes weren't embarrassing, they were fatal. "Nurse." Jennifer Martinez had worked emergency medicine for 8 years and recognized competence when she saw it. Without questioning Maya's authority, she began following orders that demonstrated knowledge far beyond anything a medical technician should possess. "How do you know?" Walsh started to ask, but Maya cut him off with a look that suggested questions. Could wait until their patient was breathing. Maya's assessment of Torres's condition was rapid and comprehensive. Cardiac arrest complicated by medication interactions and underlying trauma responses that required approaches Walsh hadn't learned in medical school. She managed multiple treatment protocols simultaneously, adjusting interventions based on patient responses that she read like text in a familiar language. "Rhythms changing," Martinez announced from the cardiac monitor. "We're getting organized activity." Maya's hands never stopped moving, performing chest compressions with perfect technique, while monitoring Torres's pupils for signs of brain function. Her training had taught her to think 3 steps ahead, anticipating complications before they developed and preparing solutions for problems that might never arise. "Pulse is back," Martinez said, her voice carrying amazement that bordered on disbelief. "Blood pressure stabilizing." Torres's eyes fluttered open, unfocused but alive. Maya continued her assessment, checking neurological function and ensuring that the cardiac rhythm remained stable. Her movements were economical and purposeful, wasting no motion while missing no detail. "He's going to be okay," Maya said finally, stepping back as the crisis stabilized. "Monitor his cardiac rhythm for the next 4 hours. Watch for signs of cerebral hypoxia, and make sure his medication dosages are adjusted for his current weight and liver function." Walsh stared at her with a mixture of gratitude and confusion. "Where did you learn to do that? Those techniques aren't standard civilian protocols." Maya's response was characteristically modest. "I've had some medical training." She began cleaning up the equipment she'd used, her movements returning to the quiet efficiency that marked her normal demeanor. But Martinez wasn't satisfied with deflection. "That wasn't some medical training," Martinez said firmly. That was battlefield medicine. You handled that code better than physicians with 20 years of experience. Before Maya could respond, the room filled with additional staff responding to the emergency call. Dr. Foster arrived with the night supervisor, expecting to find a typical cardiac arrest situation. Instead, she found Torres stable and alert, with Maya quietly returning to her janitorial duties as if nothing extraordinary had occurred. "What happened here?" Foster asked, looking around the room at faces that carried expressions ranging from amazement to confusion. "Ms. Rodriguez saved his life," Walsh said simply. "I was in over my head and she took control of the situation. I've never seen anything like it." Foster's eyes found Maya, who was disposing of medical waste with the same methodical attention. She brought to emptying trash cans. The contrast between her extraordinary capabilities and her assigned duties was so stark it bordered on criminal negligence. "Maya," Foster said gently, "could you walk me through what happened?" Maya's account was clinical and precise, focusing on medical protocols rather than her own actions. She described Torres's condition, the interventions required, and the patient outcomes with the detached professionalism of someone who'd written too many after-action reports for similar emergencies. What she didn't mention was how familiar this felt: the weight of responsibility for another person's life, the necessity of making critical decisions under pressure, the satisfaction of seeing training and instinct combine to pull someone back from the edge of death. These were the moments that defined her, regardless of whatever job title appeared on her employment records. "Maya," Foster said when the medical summary was complete, "where did you learn advanced cardiac life support techniques?" "I picked up some things during my military service," Maya replied, her thumb unconsciously tracing her pendant in that familiar pattern of 15 touches. "Sometimes you learn what you need to learn." But Foster was beginning to understand that Maya's modesty masked experiences that went far beyond picking up some things. The techniques she'd used were advanced enough to challenge experienced emergency physicians, implemented with confidence that suggested extensive practice under high-stress conditions as the night shift returned to normal operations. Word of Maya's performance spread through the hospital's informal communication networks. By morning, the story had reached staff members who'd been wondering about the quiet janitor with the mysterious background and extraordinary patient rapport. Mitchell arrived for his morning shift to find his carefully constructed narrative about Maya's incompetence crumbling under the weight of documented heroism. His first instinct was damage control, find ways to minimize Maya's actions, question her authority to intervene, suggest that she'd overstepped her assigned duties. Rodriguez had no business involving herself in medical emergencies, he told Dr. Foster during their morning administrative meeting. "She's assigned to janitorial duties, not patient care. Her intervention could have created liability issues for the facility." Foster's response carried ice that could have chilled summer air. "Maya Rodriguez saved a man's life last night while performing procedures that would have challenged our most experienced physicians. If you want to discuss liability issues, perhaps we should examine why someone with her capabilities has been assigned to empty trash cans." Mitchell realized he was facing a problem that couldn't be solved through his usual tactics of harassment and intimidation. Maya's competence was now documented, witnessed, and impossible to dismiss. His solution was to escalate his attacks, hoping to drive her away before anyone asked harder questions about her background and qualifications. What he didn't realize was that his window for damage control had already closed. The allies who'd been investigating Maya's true service record had connected her emergency room performance with the classified operations they'd been uncovering. The picture emerging was of heroism so extraordinary that Mitchell's harassment would soon appear not just wrong, but catastrophically, career-endingly wrong. The breaking point had arrived, and the truth about Maya Rodriguez was about to shatter. Every assumption about strength, competence, and what it meant to serve others under impossible conditions. The morning after Maya's life-saving intervention, Captain Park received another encrypted call that would accelerate everything. This time, the voice belonged to General Patricia Williams, Colonel Williams's sister, and a 3-star general with enough authority to move mountains when properly motivated. Her tone carried the weight of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. Captain Park, I understand you've been investigating the treatment of Sergeant Maya Rodriguez at your facility. I'm flying to Denver tomorrow, and I want a complete briefing on everything you've discovered. Park felt her pulse quicken. General Williams's involvement meant this situation had escalated far beyond local harassment complaints. Ma'am, may I ask what your interest is in Sergeant Rodriguez? Maya Rodriguez carried my nephew to safety during Operation Mountain Shield. Private First Class David Williams would have died in that desert if not for her courage and medical expertise. The fact that she's being harassed by some civilian bureaucrat makes this personal. The connection clicked off, leaving Park with 12 hours to compile a briefing that would determine Maya's future and possibly end Mitchell's career. She immediately contacted her allies, calling an emergency meeting that would bring together everyone who'd been investigating Maya's true background. Sergeant Chun arrived first, carrying a folder thick with documentation he'd gathered from veteran community sources. His expression was grim as he laid out photographs, testimony, and service records that painted a picture of heroism that defied belief. I've been talking to people who served with Maya's unit. Chun began without preamble. Operation Mountain Shield wasn't just about rescuing 15 wounded soldiers. It was about impossible odds, tactical brilliance, and physical endurance. That shouldn't have been possible for someone Maya's size. The photographs Chun had collected showed the terrain where Maya had performed her legendary rescue. Barren mountains, rocky outcroppings, and valleys that offered no cover from enemy observation. The distance between the ambush site and the extraction zone was over a kilometer of hostile territory that would have challenged a full squad of infantry. Master Sergeant Johnson served with the air support unit that provided cover for the extraction, Chun continued. She said Maya made 17 trips back and forth, carrying wounded soldiers one at a time because she wasn't strong enough to move 2 at once. 17 trips through territory where enemy snipers had clear sight lines. Dr. Foster arrived with her own documentation, medical records and patient testimonies that demonstrated Maya's therapeutic abilities with combat veterans. Her evidence focused on psychological healing rather than physical rescue, but it painted the same picture of someone whose understanding of trauma came from personal experience rather than textbook study. These veterans trust her completely, Foster explained, spreading out patient evaluation forms that showed remarkable improvement rates. Marcus Thompson hadn't spoken about his combat experience in 3 years. After 2 conversations with Maya, he was participating in group therapy. Sarah Mitchell had been suicidal since her medical discharge. Maya somehow convinced her to enter treatment. Foster's documentation revealed patterns that supported everything they'd been discovering about Maya's background. Veterans with the most severe trauma responses showed the most dramatic improvement after interacting with her, suggesting she possessed insights that transcended formal training. She uses techniques I don't recognize, Foster continued. Language, patterns, positioning strategies, crisis intervention methods that aren't taught in civilian psychology programs. Whatever training she received, it was designed for battlefield conditions where standard approaches wouldn't work. Captain Park had compiled the most damaging evidence against Mitchell, documenting his systematic harassment campaign and the ways he'd wasted Maya's extraordinary capabilities. Her folder contained witness statements, performance evaluations, and records of patient complaints about reduced quality of care since Maya's reassignment to janitorial duties. Mitchell has created a hostile work environment that would constitute grounds for federal investigation even if Maya were an ordinary employee, Park explained. But given what we now know about her background, his behavior becomes something approaching criminal negligence. The three allies spent hours connecting the dots between Maya's classified service record, her current harassment, and the evidence of her extraordinary capabilities that continued to surface despite Mitchell's efforts to suppress them. What emerged was a comprehensive case that would be impossible for any reasonable authority to ignore. "We need to understand why Maya won't defend herself," Chun observed. "Someone with her record should have the confidence to fight back against harassment. Why does she accept treatment that she clearly doesn't deserve?" Foster had been thinking about this question from a clinical perspective. Survivors' guilt is common among combat veterans, especially those who lived through situations where others died. Maya might believe she doesn't deserve recognition or fair treatment because she survived when her teammates didn't. Park nodded agreement. Colonel Williams mentioned that Maya's entire unit was killed except for her and the soldiers she rescued. That kind of psychological weight could make someone feel like they don't deserve better treatment than what Mitchell's giving her. As they compiled their evidence, a fuller picture of Maya's psychological state began to emerge. Here was someone carrying the weight of extraordinary heroism while believing she was simply a survivor who'd gotten lucky. Her daily ritual of touching her pendant 15 times wasn't just remembrance. It was penance for living when others had died. "She counts everything in patterns of 15, Chun observed. 15 touches of the pendant, 15 minutes of meditation, 15 items in her emergency bag. She's carrying those rescued soldiers with her every moment of every day." Foster's clinical training recognized the behavior patterns of someone using ritual and routine to manage overwhelming psychological burdens. Maya has created a structure that allows her to function while carrying guilt that would destroy most people. Mitchell's harassment isn't just cruel, it's attacking someone who's already carrying more weight than any person should bear. Meanwhile, Mitchell had begun his own investigation into Maya's sudden competence during the medical emergency. His inquiries revealed details that threatened his carefully constructed narrative about her incompetence, forcing him to confront evidence that he'd been spectacularly wrong about her capabilities. "Rodriguez has no advanced medical training in her personnel file," Mitchell told his assistant while reviewing employment records. "Yet witnesses say she performed procedures that would challenge experienced physicians. Either she's been lying about her qualifications, or someone has been hiding information about her background." Mitchell's investigation led him down paths that would have terrified him if he'd understood their implications. References to classified operations, redacted service records, and gaps in documentation that suggested involvement in activities far more significant than routine medical support. But Mitchell's arrogance prevented him from recognizing the signs that should have warned him to back down. Instead of acknowledging his mistake, he doubled down on his harassment campaign, convinced that Maya's competence somehow proved she'd been deceiving him about her qualifications. "I want a complete review of Rodriguez's credentials," he told his administrative staff. "If she's been misrepresenting her training or experience, I want documentation that will support her immediate termination." What Mitchell didn't realize was that his investigation was being monitored by people with security clearances high enough to understand exactly what those classified references meant. His inquiries had triggered alerts that reached General Williams's staff, accelerating the timeline for official intervention. The pieces were falling into place for a confrontation that would expose Mitchell's incompetence, reveal Maya's heroism, and demonstrate that true strength couldn't be diminished by bureaucratic harassment. General Williams was coming to Denver with authority to act decisively, and Maya's allies had compiled evidence that would make any defense of Mitchell's behavior impossible. The only question remaining was whether Maya would be ready to accept the recognition she'd spent years avoiding, or whether her commitment to carrying guilt would prevent her from embracing the honor she'd earned through courage that few could imagine and fewer could match. General Patricia Williams arrived at Denver International Airport on a gray Thursday morning, her military bearing unmistakable even in civilian clothes. The three-star general had flown commercial to avoid drawing attention, but her presence carried the weight of someone accustomed to commanding divisions and making decisions that affected thousands of lives. She'd come to Denver with a single purpose: ensuring that Maya Rodriguez received the justice and recognition that had been denied to her for far too long. Captain Park met Williams at the airport, her nervous energy barely contained as she briefed the general during the drive to the VA medical center. The folder of evidence she'd compiled over weeks of investigation sat between them, thick with documentation that would either vindicate Maya or destroy the careers of those who'd failed her. "Tell me about Mitchell," Williams said without preamble, her tone suggesting she'd already formed preliminary opinions about the man who'd been harassing her nephew's rescuer. "Director Mitchell has 22 years of healthcare administration experience," Park began carefully. "No military service, no combat deployments, no understanding of what veterans have experienced. He's built his career on bureaucratic efficiency rather than compassionate care." Williams's expression hardened. "And he's been systematically attacking someone who saved 15 lives under impossible combat conditions?" "Yes, ma'am." "Mitchell has reassigned Sergeant Rodriguez to janitorial duties, publicly humiliated her during staff meetings, and questioned her mental fitness for duty. He's wasting extraordinary medical talent while creating a hostile work environment that would be illegal in any federal workplace." The general's jaw tightened as Park detailed Mitchell's harassment campaign. Williams had spent 30 years in the military and had seen plenty of leaders who confused authority with cruelty, but attacking a decorated veteran while holding no military experience himself represented a special category of cowardice that demanded correction. Meanwhile, Mitchell was preparing for what he believed would be his moment of vindication. Word had reached him that a high-ranking official was visiting the facility for what administration had termed a routine inspection, and he saw the opportunity to publicly demonstrate his concerns about Maya's fitness for duty. "I want Rodriguez working during the inspection," Mitchell told his administrative assistant. "I want the visiting officials to see exactly what kind of employee we're dealing with. Sometimes you have to make examples to maintain proper standards." Mitchell had spent days preparing his presentation about Maya's supposed inadequacies, compiling what he believed was evidence of her weakness and unsuitability for healthcare work. His PowerPoint slides featured carefully selected performance metrics that omitted her patient satisfaction scores, her emergency response capabilities, and the dramatic improvements in veteran care that occurred whenever she was involved in treatment. What Mitchell didn't realize was that his routine inspection was actually a targeted investigation led by someone with personal investment in Maya's welfare and the authority to end his career with a single phone call. His plans for public humiliation were about to backfire in ways that would expose his own incompetence to the very officials he'd hoped to impress. Dr. Foster had been working behind the scenes to ensure that Maya's extraordinary capabilities would be on full display during the inspection. She'd arranged for several of Maya's most successful patient interactions to be documented, scheduled therapy sessions that would demonstrate her unique rapport with combat veterans, and positioned herself to provide testimony about therapeutic techniques that exceeded formal training. "Maya doesn't realize what's happening," Foster confided to Sergeant Chun during their final preparation meeting. "She thinks this is just another day of harassment from Mitchell. She has no idea that people who understand her true value are finally in position to act." Chun had been observing Maya's behavior over the past few days, noting increased anxiety that manifested in more frequent touching of her pendant and longer periods of silent meditation. She seemed to sense that something significant was approaching, though her humble nature prevented her from imagining it might be recognition rather than further punishment. "She's been carrying this weight for so long that she can't imagine it being lifted," Chun observed. "Maya has convinced herself that she doesn't deserve better treatment than what Mitchell's been giving her." The inspection was scheduled for Friday afternoon, giving Williams time to review all evidence and speak privately with key witnesses. Her preliminary conversations with Foster, Shun, and Park had confirmed everything she'd suspected about Maya's treatment and Mitchell's incompetence. "I want to speak with Rodriguez before the inspection," Williams told Park. "She needs to understand that people who value her service are finally in position to act on her behalf." But Maya had her own plans for the inspection day. She'd requested permission to work a double shift, hoping to minimize her visibility during whatever evaluation Mitchell had planned. Her strategy for surviving harassment had always involved making herself as inconspicuous as possible, and she saw no reason to change tactics now. "I'll be working in the basement storage areas during the inspection," Maya told Foster when asked about her schedule. "Director Mitchell prefers when I stay out of sight during important events." Foster's heart broke at Maya's matter-of-fact acceptance of treatment that no decorated veteran should endure. "Maya, what if I told you that this inspection might result in changes that improve your working conditions?" Maya's response carried the weary wisdom of someone who'd learned not to expect justice in bureaucratic systems. "Dr. Foster, I appreciate your optimism, but people like Director Mitchell don't change their opinions about people like me. I've learned that it's better to keep my head down and do my job." The conversation revealed the depth of psychological damage that Mitchell's harassment had inflicted on someone whose heroism should have been celebrated rather than punished. Maya had internalized the treatment she'd received, believing that she somehow deserved the degradation that had been heaped upon her. What Maya didn't know was that General Williams had brought with her a folder containing the complete, unredacted record of Operation Mountain Shield, including after-action reports, witness statements, and recommendations for the highest military honors. She'd also brought something else, a letter from her nephew, David Williams, describing how Maya Rodriguez had saved his life and expressing his outrage that his rescuer was being mistreated. "She carried me for over a kilometer through enemy territory," David had written to his aunt. "I weighed 180 pounds, she weighed maybe 115, and she never stopped moving even when bullets were hitting the ground around us. Maya Rodriguez is the reason I'm alive to write this letter, and the fact that someone is harassing her makes me sick." The letter had been the final catalyst that brought General Williams to Denver, with fire in her eyes and authority to act decisively. Maya Rodriguez was about to receive the recognition she'd earned in the dust and chaos of Afghanistan, whether she believed she deserved it or not. Friday afternoon was approaching, and with it would come the confrontation that would expose Mitchell's incompetence, reveal Maya's heroism, and demonstrate that true strength couldn't be diminished by bureaucratic harassment from someone who'd never understood the weight of genuine sacrifice. The stage was set for justice, vindication, and the revelation that would transform a quiet janitor into recognition as one of the most extraordinary soldiers of her generation. Friday afternoon arrived with the kind of crisp autumn air that made the Rocky Mountains look like a postcard. But inside the Denver VA Medical Center, the atmosphere crackled with tension that had nothing to do with weather. General Patricia Williams had positioned herself strategically in the main conference room, surrounded by Mitchell's administrative staff, visiting officials, and the allies who'd spent weeks building a case that would either vindicate Maya Rodriguez or destroy everyone who'd failed her. Mitchell entered the room with the confidence of someone who believed he was about to demonstrate his superior judgment to impressed officials. His presentation materials were perfectly organized, his talking points rehearsed, and his conviction absolute that Maya Rodriguez represented everything wrong with modern veteran services. What he didn't realize was that he was walking into an ambush orchestrated by people who understood her true value. "Ladies and gentlemen," Mitchell began, his voice carrying the theatrical authority he'd cultivated during 22 years of bureaucratic climbing. "Today I want to discuss the challenges we face when hiring standards are compromised by social pressure rather than professional competence." General Williams sat perfectly still, her 3-star bearing unmistakable even. In civilian clothes. Her expression revealed nothing as Mitchell launched into his prepared attack on Maya's qualifications, work ethic, and suitability for veteran care. But those who knew her recognized the controlled fury of someone watching a coward attack a hero. Take, for example, our employee Maya Rodriguez, Mitchell continued, pulling up slides that showed carefully selected performance metrics, consistently rated as merely adequate by supervisors, lacking initiative and problem-solving, demonstrating emotional instability under pressure. This is what happens when we prioritize diversity over competence. Mitchell clicked to his next slide, which showed Maya's current assignment to janitorial duties. After repeated performance failures, I was forced to reassign Rodriguez to tasks more appropriate to her capabilities. Sometimes difficult decisions are necessary to maintain professional standards. Dr. Foster felt her hands clench involuntarily as Mitchell's presentation continued. She documented every instance of his harassment, every example of Maya's extraordinary competence, and every veteran whose care had improved dramatically through Maya's intervention. Mitchell's narrative was not just wrong, it was criminally negligent. Additionally, Mitchell said, warming to his theme, Rodriguez has demonstrated concerning behavioral patterns that suggest psychological instability. Obsessive rituals, social isolation, inability to accept constructive criticism. These are red flags that cannot be ignored in a healthcare environment. Captain Park had positioned herself where she could observe General Williams's reaction to Mitchell's character assassination. The general's expression remained neutral, but her hands showed white knuckles that suggested barely controlled rage at watching someone without military experience attack a decorated combat veteran. Mitchell's presentation reached its climax as he displayed what he believed was his most damning evidence. Most concerning of all, Rodriguez has been misrepresenting her qualifications and overstepping her assigned duties. During a recent medical emergency, she assumed authority she doesn't possess, performing procedures beyond her training level. The room fell silent as Mitchell paused for effect, believing he'd successfully demonstrated Maya's unfitness for duty. What he'd actually done was provide General Williams with the perfect opening to destroy him completely. Director Mitchell, Williams said, her voice carrying the quiet authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. Could you clarify what qualifications you believe Maya Rodriguez lacks? Mitchell's confidence soared at what he perceived as official interest in his concerns. Certainly. Rodriguez has basic medical technician training, no advanced certifications, no leadership experience, and no evidence of the kind of high-pressure decision-making required for emergency medicine. Williams nodded thoughtfully, then opened the folder she'd been carrying. That's interesting, because according to the documents I have here, Sergeant Maya Rodriguez is one of the most decorated combat medics of her generation. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees as Williams began reading from Maya's actual service record. Silver Star for gallantry in action. Bronze Star with V device for heroism in combat. Purple Heart for wounds received in enemy action. Combat medical badge with 3 deployment stars. Mitchell's face cycled through colors like a broken traffic light as the implications began to dawn on him. But Williams wasn't finished destroying his carefully constructed narrative. Operation Mountain Shield, Afghanistan, 2019, Williams continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. Sergeant Rodriguez and her unit were ambushed during a humanitarian mission to provide medical care to remote villages. 15 soldiers were wounded and pinned down by coordinated enemy assault. The room was dead silent now, every person present understanding they were witnessing the revelation of extraordinary heroism that had been deliberately buried. Williams's voice took on the tone of someone recounting a legend. For 8 hours, while under continuous enemy fire, Sergeant Maya Rodriguez made 17 trips through hostile territory, carrying wounded soldiers one by one to a defensible extraction point. 17 trips, Director Mitchell. through a kilometer of terrain where enemy snipers had clear sight lines. Mitchell tried to speak, to salvage something from the wreckage of his position, but Williams's voice cut through his stammering like a sword through paper. Maya Rodriguez weighs 115 pounds. The soldiers she rescued ranged from 160 to 220 pounds each. The mathematics alone should tell you something about the strength and determination required for what she accomplished. Dr. Foster felt tears streaming down her face as Williams continued the account of Maya's heroism. Everything they'd suspected about her background was being confirmed in details that defied belief but carried the weight of official documentation. Between rescue operations, Sergeant Rodriguez performed field surgery with minimal supplies, managed pain medication for multiple patients, and maintained tactical awareness that prevented the extraction point from being overrun. Her actions saved 15 lives under conditions that would have challenged a full medical team. Williams's voice grew harder as she addressed Mitchell directly. "You've been harassing one of the most decorated combat veterans of her generation, Director Mitchell. You've assigned a Silver Star recipient to clean bathrooms. You've questioned the mental stability of someone whose courage under fire saved 15 American lives." The general stood, her bearing radiating authority that made everyone in the room straighten unconsciously. "Where I come from, we call that a court-martial offense. In civilian terms, you've created a hostile work environment that constitutes federal civil rights violations." Mitchell's mouth opened and closed soundlessly as he tried to process the magnitude of his mistake. He'd spent months attacking someone whose heroism exceeded anything in his comprehension, whose qualifications made his own administrative credentials look laughably inadequate. But General Williams, he finally managed to stammer, her personnel file showed only basic training, administrative assignments. Her record was classified to protect operational security and the lives of people still serving in sensitive positions. Williams cut him off. Maya Rodriguez's heroism was buried in bureaucratic files, because that's what happened to soldiers who performed missions that couldn't be publicly acknowledged. The room erupted in whispered conversations as staff members began understanding the scope of Mitchell's failure. Here was someone who should have been training the next generation of combat medics, instead relegated to emptying trash cans because a bureaucrat couldn't recognize greatness when it stood quietly before him. Williams wasn't finished. "I have here a letter from my nephew, Private First Class David Williams, one of the soldiers Maya Rodriguez carried to safety. He weighs 180 pounds. She carried him for over a kilometer while bullets were hitting the ground around them." The general's voice cracked slightly with emotion as she continued. "David writes that Maya Rodriguez is the reason he's alive today, the reason he was able to marry his high school sweetheart, the reason he'll be able to hold his newborn daughter next month. And you've been systematically humiliating his rescuer." Mitchell realized his career was over, his reputation destroyed, his judgment revealed as catastrophically flawed. But the worst was yet to come, because Maya Rodriguez was about to enter the room and face the recognition she'd spent years avoiding. The conference room door opened quietly as Maya Rodriguez entered, responding to an urgent page that had interrupted her basement cleaning duties. She wore her standard custodial uniform, carried cleaning supplies in a small cart, and moved with the same quiet efficiency that had marked all her interactions at the facility. What she didn't expect was to find 30 people staring at her, with expressions ranging from awe to shame. Maya's eyes swept the room, automatically cataloging exits, potential threats, and the positioning of everyone present. Her combat training never fully switched off, even in situations that posed no physical danger. She noticed General Williams' immediately military bearing was unmistakable, but couldn't have imagined the three-star general's connection to her past. "Sergeant Rodriguez," Williams said, her voice carrying warmth that made Maya stiffen with recognition. "Please come in. We've been discussing your service record." Maya's hand moved unconsciously to her pendant. her thumb beginning the familiar pattern of 15 touches that had become her anchor in moments of stress. The formal use of her military rank sent warning signals through her nervous system, suggesting that her carefully maintained anonymity was about to be shattered. "Ma'am," Maya said quietly, her voice barely carrying beyond the immediate vicinity, "I believe there's been some mistake. I'm assigned to cleaning duties today." Williams gestured to an empty chair near the front of the room. "Please, sit down." "There's no mistake, Maya. We're here because it's time for the truth about Operation Mountain Shield to be told." The name of the operation hit Maya like a physical blow. She'd spent years burying those memories, refusing interviews, declining recognition, and building a life where she could serve others without the weight of heroic expectations. Now, surrounded by strangers in a conference room, her greatest fear was materializing. "General," Maya said, her voice steadier than her hands, "I would prefer not to discuss classified operations in a public setting." "Nothing we're discussing is classified anymore," Williams replied gently. "Your actions during Mountain Shield have been declassified because the American people deserve to know what real heroism looks like." Dr. Foster watched Maya's reaction with clinical interest and personal heartbreak. Here was someone who'd saved 15 lives under impossible conditions, yet seemed more terrified of recognition than she'd ever been of enemy fire. The psychological weight Maya carried was becoming visible to everyone in the room. Williams opened her folder and began reading from official after-action reports. September 15, 2019. Specialist Maya Rodriguez and her medical unit were providing humanitarian assistance to coalition forces and civilian populations in remote villages of Helmand Province. Maya closed her eyes, her breathing becoming more controlled as she employed techniques learned for managing stress in combat zones. But these weren't insurgent attacks or medical emergencies. This was something far more dangerous to her carefully constructed emotional defenses. At 0630 hours, the unit came under coordinated attack from insurgent forces estimated at company strength. 15 soldiers were wounded in the initial assault, with casualties ranging from minor shrapnel wounds to life-threatening trauma. The room had gone completely silent, every person present understanding they were witnessing the revelation of extraordinary heroism that had been deliberately hidden for years. Mitchell sat frozen in his chair, the magnitude of his mistakes becoming clearer with each word Williams spoke. Specialist Rodriguez immediately established a casualty collection point and began assessing wounded personnel while under continuous enemy fire. Initial estimates suggested extraction would require 4 to 6 hours, during which time several critically wounded soldiers would not survive without immediate evacuation. Maya's fingers had found their rhythm on the pendant, counting 15 touches over and over while her lips moved silently. Those who knew her recognized the coping mechanism she used to manage overwhelming psychological pressure. Rather than wait for extraction, Specialist Rodriguez made the decision to move all wounded personnel to a more defensible position near the designated landing zone. This required individual transport of each casualty through approximately 1 kilometer of hostile territory. Williams's voice grew stronger as she continued the account, each detail building a picture of heroism that defied rational belief. Maya had stopped touching her pendant and was staring at a fixed point on the wall, her mind clearly transported back to the dust and chaos of Afghanistan. For the next 8 hours, Specialist Rodriguez made 17 individual trips through enemy-controlled territory, carrying wounded soldiers who outweighed her by 60 to 100 pounds each. She moved during daylight, under observation from enemy positions, while maintaining tactical awareness sufficient to avoid ambush. Captain Park found herself holding her breath as Williams detailed the impossible mathematics of Maya's rescue operation. The logistics alone should have made the mission suicidal, yet somehow Maya had succeeded where larger, better-equipped units might have failed. Between rescue operations, Specialist Rodriguez performed field surgery, managed pain, medication from multiple patients, and coordinated air support through damaged communication equipment. Her medical interventions kept all 15 casualties stable until evacuation arrived. Dr. Foster noticed that Maya's breathing had changed to the controlled pattern of someone managing a panic response. This wasn't just unwanted attention, this was forced confrontation with memories that Maya had spent years learning to compartmentalize. When extraction helicopters finally arrived, Specialist Rodriguez refused evacuation until all wounded personnel had been loaded and secured. She was the last person to leave the area, having spent 8 hours under enemy fire to ensure that 15 American soldiers would return home alive. Williams closed the folder and looked directly at Maya, her expression mixing official respect with personal gratitude. My nephew David was one of those 15 soldiers, Maya. He weighed 180 pounds when you carried him to safety. You saved his life. Maya's composure finally cracked as the personal connection was revealed. Her eyes filled with tears she'd been suppressing for years, and when she spoke, her voice carried the weight of survivor's guilt that had haunted her since Afghanistan. "General Williams," Maya said, her words barely audible, "I need you to understand something. I didn't save 15 soldiers that day. I lost 6 members of my medical team. Rogers, Chun, Martinez, Thompson, Kumar, and Williams. They died holding the perimeter while I moved casualties." The admission hung in the air like smoke from a battlefield, revealing the psychological burden that had driven Maya to seek anonymity rather than recognition. She wasn't running from glory. She was carrying the weight of teammates who'd made the ultimate sacrifice. Those 15 soldiers lived because 6 medics gave their lives. Maya continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. "Every day, I touch this pendant 15 times once for each person who survived. But I carry 6 names in my heart, and they're the ones who deserve the medals." Williams stood and approached Maya, her own eyes bright with unshed tears. "Maya, those 6 medics died as heroes. But you lived as one too. Your guilt doesn't diminish their sacrifice, it honors it. And their sacrifice doesn't diminish your heroism." The general's words carried the authority of someone who'd made similar life-and-death decisions, who understood the weight that some soldiers carried long after the shooting stopped. But Maya's response revealed depths of pain that recognition couldn't heal. "I was supposed to keep them safe," Maya whispered. "I was the senior medic. They died because I couldn't figure out how to save everyone." The room had become a confessional, with Maya finally voicing the guilt that had driven her to accept Mitchell's harassment as somehow deserved punishment. Her heroism was inseparable from her trauma, her strength intertwined with wounds that might never fully heal, but General Williams wasn't finished. The revelation of Maya's identity was only the beginning of a reckoning that would transform not just her life, but the entire understanding of what strength looked like in the face of impossible sacrifice. The silence in the conference room stretched until General Williams spoke again, her voice carrying the weight of absolute authority mixed with profound respect. "Maya, I want you to hear something from the soldiers you rescued. They've been trying to find you for years." Williams pulled out her phone and played a recording that had been prepared specifically for this moment. The voice belonged to Staff Sergeant Marcus Thompson, his Midwestern accent clear despite the emotion that made his words tremble. "Ma'am, if you're hearing this, then someone finally found you. I was number 7, the one with the chest wound, who kept saying I was going to die. You told me to shut up and save my breath for breathing. You carried me when I couldn't walk, and you kept me alive when medical textbooks said I shouldn't have made it." Maya's hands clenched in her lap as Thompson's voice continued, each word carving away at the guilt she'd carried for years. "I want you to know that I got married last year. My wife Sarah is pregnant with our first child. That baby is going to exist because you refused to let me die in that desert." The recording shifted to another voice, Corporal David Williams. General Williams's nephew. Maya, I've been looking for you since I got stateside. You probably don't remember, but you sang to me while you carried me. Some Spanish lullaby your grandmother used to sing. I was delirious from blood loss, but I remember that song. Maya's composure cracked completely as David's voice brought back memories she'd buried beneath layers of professional detachment. She had sung to him not from any medical training, but from pure human instinct to comfort someone who was dying far from home. I named my daughter Maya, David continued, his voice thick with gratitude. Maya Williams, born 3 weeks ago. She's going to grow up knowing that her namesake is the reason her daddy came home from the war. Dr. Foster watched Maya's reaction with clinical attention and personal heartbreak. Here was someone learning that her heroism had created ripple effects extending far beyond that single day in Afghanistan. But Maya's response revealed how deeply survivors' guilt had shaped her self-perception. "They don't understand," Maya whispered, tears streaming down her face. Rogers held the perimeter for 6 hours with a bullet in his shoulder. Chun performed surgery while mortar were falling around us. Martinez gave me his blood when we ran out of transfusion supplies. They're the heroes. I just survived. General Williams moved closer, her voice gentle but insistent. Maya, heroism isn't about who lives or dies. It's about choices made under impossible circumstances. Your teammates chose to hold that perimeter. You chose to save every life you could reach. All of you were heroes. The general gestured toward the folder containing Maya's service record. The Army doesn't award silver stars for survival. They award them for gallantry in action that saves American lives. The Bronze Star with V device isn't given for luck. It's recognition of heroism in the face of armed enemy forces. Mitchell sat frozen in his chair, watching his worldview crumble as the true measure of Maya's character was revealed. Every criticism he'd made about her strength, competence, and leadership had been not just wrong, but spectacularly, embarrassingly wrong. Williams turned her attention to Mitchell, with the controlled fury of someone who'd spent her career dealing with incompetent leaders who mistook cruelty for strength. Director Mitchell, you've been harassing one of the most decorated soldiers of her generation. You've questioned the mental stability of someone whose courage saved 15 American lives. Mitchell tried to respond, to salvage something from his position, but Williams cut him off with the kind of command voice that had directed military operations across multiple theaters of war. You assigned a Silver Star recipient to clean bathrooms. You publicly humiliated someone who carried wounded soldiers through enemy fire for 8 hours. You created a hostile work environment for a combat veteran whose service record makes your administrative credentials look like participation trophies. The room watched in stunned silence as Mitchell's career disintegrated under the weight of his own ignorance. But Williams wasn't finished demonstrating the scope of his failure. Captain Park, Williams said, turning to Maya's ally, please read Director Mitchell's military service record for comparison. Park consulted her notes with barely concealed satisfaction. Director Mitchell has no military service record, ma'am. 0 deployments, 0 combat experience, 0 understanding of what military service actually requires. Williams nodded grimly. So we have a situation where someone with no military experience has been systematically attacking a decorated combat veteran. In my world, Director Mitchell, we call that conduct unbecoming. Sergeant Chun stepped forward, his Marine bearing evident as he addressed the room. Ma'am, I've been documenting Maya's performance since she started working here. Patient satisfaction scores in the top 5%, emergency response capabilities that exceed many physicians, and therapeutic relationships with combat veterans that produce better outcomes than formal counseling programs. Dr. Foster joined the testimony, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd spent years studying trauma recovery. Maya's understanding of combat-related psychological injuries comes from personal experience, not textbook study. Veterans trust her because they recognize someone who's been where they've been. The accumulated evidence painted a picture that made Mitchell's harassment appear not just wrong, but criminally negligent. Here was extraordinary talent being wasted by someone too incompetent to recognize what stood before him. Maya listened to the testimonies with growing amazement. She'd spent years seeing herself as a failure who'd survived when better people died. Now she was hearing evidence that her continued service had meaning beyond her own guilt and self-recrimination. "Maya," Williams said, returning her attention to the woman at the center of this revelation, "I want to offer you a position that matches your capabilities and honors your service. The Army Medical Command needs someone with your experience to train the next generation of combat medics." Maya's response revealed how completely Mitchell's harassment had damaged her self-perception. "General, with respect, I'm not qualified for that kind of responsibility. I've been working custodial duties because Director Mitchell determined that was appropriate to my skill level." Williams's expression shifted to something approaching maternal protectiveness. "Maya, Director Mitchell's opinion of your capabilities is irrelevant. You're qualified because you've done things that other people only read about in after-action reports." The general opened another folder and began reading commendations that Maya had never seen. Recommendation for Medal of Honor, submitted by Colonel Sarah Martinez. Recommendation for Distinguished Service Cross, submitted by Captain David Chun. Recommendation for Soldier's Medal, submitted by every officer who reviewed your case. Maya stared in shock as Williams detailed recognition that had been buried in classified files. Her heroism hadn't gone unnoticed, it had been deliberately hidden to protect operational security and the lives of people still serving in sensitive positions. "The only reason you didn't receive the nation's highest honors is because Operation Mountain Shield involved assets and techniques that couldn't be publicly acknowledged," Williams explained. "Your heroism was classified, not dismissed." Mitchell realized he was witnessing the complete destruction of everything he believed about Maya Rodriguez. His harassment campaign had targeted someone whose actual qualifications made his own achievements look insignificant by comparison. But Maya's response to the revelations showed how deeply she'd internalized years of self-blame and guilt. Recognition couldn't heal wounds that went beyond professional acknowledgement to the core of her identity as a survivor who believed she'd failed her teammates. The vindication was complete, but the real work of helping Maya accept her own heroism was just beginning. 3 months after the confrontation that ended James Mitchell's career, the Denver VA Medical Center had transformed into something resembling its original mission, a place where veterans received care from people who understood their sacrifice. Maya Rodriguez stood in her new office, no longer a custodian hidden in basement storage rooms, but the newly appointed Director of Combat Trauma Recovery, a position created specifically to utilize her unique combination of heroic experience and therapeutic instincts. The transition hadn't been easy. Maya had initially refused General Williams's offer to join the Army Medical Command, insisting that she wasn't qualified for such responsibility despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary. It had taken weeks of gentle persuasion from Dr. Foster, Captain Park, and Sergeant Chun to convince her that accepting recognition didn't dishonor her fallen teammates, it honored their sacrifice by ensuring their mission continued. "You're not taking credit for what they did," Foster had explained during one of their regular counseling sessions. "You're carrying their work forward. Every medic you train, every veteran you help heal, every life you touch, that's Rogers." Chun, Martinez, Thompson, Kumar, and Williams continuing to serve through you. Maya's new office reflected her journey from anonymous janitor to recognized hero. The walls displayed her military decorations finally retrieved from classified files and presented in a ceremony that had brought tears to hardened combat veterans. Her silver star sat beside photographs of the soldiers she'd rescued, each image showing men and women who'd gone on to live full lives because of decisions made in Afghan dust and chaos. but the most prominent display was a memorial she'd created for her fallen teammates. 6 photographs arranged around a piece of twisted metal from the medical station where they'd made their final stand. Below each photo, Maya had written personal remembrances that captured not their deaths, but their lives and the qualities that had made them extraordinary medics and human beings. Sergeant First Class Maria Rogers, one inscription read, held the north perimeter for 6 hours with a bullet in her shoulder because she refused to let wounded soldiers down. She taught me that strength isn't about not feeling pain, it's about continuing to serve despite it. The memorial served dual purposes, honoring her teammates while helping Maya process the guilt that had driven her to seek punishment rather than recognition. Dr. Foster had helped her understand that survivors' guilt was common among combat veterans, especially those who'd lived through situations where others died. But Maya's case was complicated by her heroic actions, which made it difficult for her to separate survival from responsibility. Guilt tells us we could have done something different, Foster had explained. But the only thing you could have done differently was abandon those 15 soldiers. Your teammates wouldn't have wanted that, and you know it. Maya's work with combat veterans had expanded beyond individual therapy to include program development that revolutionized how the VA approached trauma recovery. Her innovations came from understanding that traditional psychological approaches often failed with veterans whose experiences transcended civilian comprehension. Maya doesn't just treat PTSD, Chun observed to Park during one of their regular check-ins. She treats it from the inside out, because she's been where these guys have been. When she tells them they're not broken, they believe her because she's living proof that you can carry impossible weight and still function. The Combat Trauma Recovery Program, Maya had developed integrated medical treatment with peer counseling, practical skills training, and purpose-driven service opportunities. Veterans who'd been written off as untreatable began responding to approaches that acknowledged their experiences rather than pathologizing them. We're not trying to fix them, Maya explained to a group of visiting officials from other VA facilities. We're helping them understand that carrying weight from combat experiences doesn't make them damaged goods. It makes them qualified to help others carry similar burdens. Maya's program had achieved results that exceeded every metric for veteran care. Suicide rates among participants had dropped to near zero. Treatment completion rates approached 90%. Most remarkably, veterans who'd been isolated and struggling began seeking ways to serve others, creating ripple effects that extended far beyond the VA system. The program's success had attracted national attention, leading to invitations for Maya to speak at medical conferences, military academies, and veteran organizations across the country. Each appearance was a struggle against her natural inclination toward anonymity, but she'd learned to frame public speaking as another form of service to the soldiers who needed advocacy. I'm not comfortable being called a hero, Maya told an audience at the National Military Medical Conference. But I'm learning that my discomfort doesn't matter if sharing my experience helps other veterans understand they're not alone in carrying difficult memories. Her speeches always included recognition of her fallen teammates, ensuring that Rogers, Chun, Martinez, Thompson, Kumar, and Williams received acknowledgement for their sacrifice. Maya had transformed her survivors' guilt into a mission that honored their memory, while helping living veterans heal from their own trauma. The ripple effects of Maya's work extended beyond individual healing to systemic change in how the military approached combat medicine training. General Williams had implemented Maya's recommendations throughout Army Medical Command, requiring that all combat medics receive training in both medical procedures and psychological first aid. Maya's approach recognizes that combat medics treat more than physical wounds, Williams explained to Pentagon officials. They're often the first psychological intervention that wounded soldiers receive. Training them to address both needs improves outcomes across the board. Mitchell's departure had cleared the way for comprehensive reforms at the Denver via that extended far beyond Maya's program. Captain Park had been promoted to Deputy Director of Operations, implementing policies that ensured veteran employees received treatment appropriate to their service and sacrifice. Dr. Foster had expanded her psychiatric services to include family counseling for veterans struggling with reintegration. Maya's vindication exposed systemic problems that went beyond one bad administrator, Park noted during a staff meeting. We had policies that protected incompetent leadership while punishing competent veterans. That had to change. The changes went beyond personnel policies to fundamental shifts in organizational culture. The Denver VA had become a model for how veteran care should operate, with respect for service, understanding of sacrifice, and recognition that those who'd served in combat brought valuable perspectives to civilian healthcare. Maya's transformation from custodian to director had become legend within veteran communities, inspiring others who'd been written off or overlooked to advocate for recognition of their own capabilities. Her story demonstrated that heroism didn't end with military service. It could be carried forward into civilian life where it continued making a difference. But Maya's greatest achievement wasn't her awards, recognition, or program success. It was learning to see herself through the eyes of the 15 soldiers she'd rescued, rather than through the lens of guilt over the 6 teammates she'd lost. The pendant she wore still carried 15 touches each day, but now they represented gratitude rather than penance. The legacy that had begun in the dust of Afghanistan continued in the halls of the Denver VA, where Maya Rodriguez ensured that no veteran would face their battles alone, and no hero would be reduced to emptying trash cans by someone too small to recognize greatness. 2 years after the confrontation that exposed her heroism, Maya Rodriguez stood before the graduating class of the National Combat Medic Training Center, an institution she'd helped design and now directed. The auditorium was filled with young men and women who would soon deploy to dangerous places where their medical training might mean the difference between life and death for their fellow soldiers. Maya looked out at faces that reminded her of herself at 22, bright with determination, unmarked by the weight of impossible decisions, ready to serve with the kind of idealism that the military needed, but combat sometimes destroyed. Her job was to give them tools that might prevent them from facing the choices she'd faced in Afghanistan. Medical training will teach you to save lives, Maya began, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd proven those lessons under the most extreme conditions. But combat medicine requires something beyond textbook knowledge. It requires understanding that every soldier you treat carries within them the possibility of 15 more lives touched by your service. The number 15 had become central to Maya's teaching philosophy, representing not just the soldiers she'd rescued, but the exponential impact that medical intervention could have on families, communities, and future generations. Each life saved created ripple effects that extended far beyond any single battlefield. When you graduate from this program, Maya continued, you won't just be medics. You'll be guardians of possibility, protectors of futures that haven't been written yet, carriers of hope in places where hope is hard to find. In the audience, General Patricia Williams watched with satisfaction as Maya delivered lessons that would be carried to combat zones around the world. The Combat Medic Training Center had become the premier institution for preparing military medical personnel, with innovations that had reduced battlefield mortality rates to historic lows. Maya's approach integrates technical training with psychological preparation. Williams had explained to congressional budget committees seeking justification for the program's funding. Her students don't just learn medical procedures, they learn how to maintain effectiveness under conditions that would break most people. The results spoke for themselves. Units with medics trained in Maya's program showed improved casualty survival rates, better unit cohesion, and reduced incidence of combat stress injuries among medical personnel. The techniques she'd developed through necessity in Afghanistan had become standard training for an entire generation of combat medics. After the graduation ceremony, Maya returned to her office where she maintained the memorial to her fallen teammates. The photographs of Rogers, Chun, Martinez, Thompson, Kumar, and Williams had been joined by letters from medics who'd applied Maya's teachings in combat situations around the world. "Ma'am," read one letter from Sergeant Lisa Park, no relation to Captain Park. "Your training on buddy carries under fire saved 3 lives during our deployment to Syria. When insurgents hit our convoy, I remembered your lesson about using size as an advantage rather than a limitation. I was able to move wounded soldiers through terrain that larger medics couldn't navigate." Maya read each letter exactly once before filing them in a cabinet she'd labeled "Mission Continues." The correspondence served as evidence that her teammates' sacrifice had meaning beyond that single day in Afghanistan. Their dedication to saving lives was literally being carried forward by medics they'd never met, but whose training had been shaped by their example. Dr. Foster continued her role as Maya's therapist and had documented her patient's remarkable psychological recovery over the past 2 years. The survivor's guilt that had once defined Maya's self-perception had been transformed into purposeful action that honored her fallen teammates while building something positive from traumatic experience. Maya has learned to see herself as a bridge between her teammates' sacrifice and ongoing service, Foster noted in her clinical summary. She carries their memory not as burden but as inspiration for continued contribution to military medicine. The Denver a medical center had become a pilgrimage site for veterans seeking the kind of understanding and treatment that Maya's programs provided. Her combat trauma recovery initiative had been replicated at VA facilities across the country, but the original program remained the gold standard for veteran care. Sergeant Tom Chun, now promoted to Director of Veteran Services, had overseen the facility's transformation from a place where heroes were hidden to an institution that celebrated service, while providing practical support for those carrying the weight of combat experience. "We went from being a place where Maya Rodriguez cleaned bathrooms to being a place where her innovations save lives every day," Chun reflected during a staff meeting. "That transformation represents everything that's possible when we recognize competence instead of punishing it." Captain Lisa Park, now Colonel Park and Regional Director for Veteran Affairs, had implemented Maya's innovations across multiple states. The systemic changes that began with exposing Mitchell's harassment had evolved into comprehensive reforms that protected veteran employees while ensuring their expertise was utilized appropriately. Maya's vindication was just the beginning. Park explained to new administrators. The real victory was proving that military experience translates into civilian competence when we're smart enough to recognize it. Maya's personal life had also evolved beyond the careful isolation she'd maintained for years after Afghanistan. She'd begun dating Dr. Michael Torres, a civilian psychiatrist who understood trauma recovery and respected her need to process combat experiences at her own pace. More importantly, she'd reconnected with families of the soldiers she'd rescued, attending weddings, baptisms, and graduations that represented futures made possible by decisions made under enemy fire. "Maya doesn't just save lives in the moment," observed Staff Sergeant Marcus Thompson during his daughter's baptism, where Maya served as godmother. "She creates families, builds communities, makes sure that heroism has consequences beyond the battlefield." The pendant Maya wore had evolved from memorial to mission statement. The 15 touches she made each day no longer represented penance for surviving. When others died, they had become acknowledgement of ongoing responsibility to serve others who needed healing, guidance, and hope. James Mitchell had disappeared from public life after his termination. His career in veteran services effectively ended by his spectacular misjudgment of Maya's capabilities. His story had become cautionary tale in healthcare administration circles about the dangers of confusing authority with wisdom, but Maya rarely thought about Mitchell anymore. Her focus had shifted to building rather than dwelling on past injustices. The Combat Medic Training Center required constant innovation, The Combat Trauma Recovery Program needed expansion to serve more veterans, and there were always young medics who needed mentoring from someone who'd faced the kinds of decisions they might encounter. The past is for learning, not living, Maya told her latest class of medic instructors. We honor our fallen by ensuring their sacrifice enables future service, not by carrying guilt that prevents us from continuing their mission. As evening settled over the Denver VA campus, Maya completed her daily ritual of touching her pendant 15 times, each touch now representing not just lives saved, but lives that would be saved by medics carrying forward the lessons learned. In Afghan dust, the quiet woman who'd once been dismissed as too weak had become a force that would influence military medicine for generations. Rogers, Chun, Martinez, Thompson, Kumar, and Williams lived on not in guilt-ridden memory, but in practical application of principles they died defending, that every life matters, that service continues beyond individual survival, and that true strength is measured not by the enemies you defeat, but by the lives you preserve, and the legacy you build from the impossible weight of carrying others to safety. The mission continued. 15 lives at a time, one lesson at a time, one healed veteran at a time, in the endless, quiet work of transforming trauma into purpose and survival into service that echoed across battlefields, not yet imagined, and lives not yet threatened, but somehow already saved by the courage of a woman who'd learned that being called too weak was just another way of saying too strong for small minds to understand. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.